This real-side experience would begin in a large, multi-levelled car parking lot, and indeed, the exact same parking lot I have visited on previous real-side experiences. It has become quite apparent that based on its structure, its multi-layered design, that it is representing a creation. For many an experience have I had, where I have moved through the levels of it, each representing then the 5 creational life levels, from the physical to the etheric. The top level of this multi-levelled parking lot is always open and exposed to the sky above, and would represent the ethereal level, with the sky above being the endlessness of the isness, the true reality that must be recognized, aside from the creational simulator that is a reflection of it, but a simulator that is essential as an overall comparison by which this recognition can be made. There was an occasion where I was leading a group of individuals through the various levels of this very simulator representing a parking lot, and as we proceeded, we would come up against constant barriers that represented self-imposed and decided restrictions, barriers that would limit the ability of the group to move freely through the entirety of a simulator that is an effect reality of their personal created selves. Only then, as we decide, agree, and focus on certain areas only of the entirety of the personal self, do we limit ourselves accordingly. Generally, the emotional sensation parts of the personal self, and so most are resigned to the astral areas that are the effect realities of this limited emotional focus. So it followed that these barriers were self-imposed, and a general agreement, decision of limitation shared by this group. Not so much then that I was removing the barriers, the limitations for them, as we can't violate individuals' free will to decide whatever they will, but more that I was assisting them to see, beyond their limited bubbles of creational reality, that they would have the intent then to see more, to be more, and move beyond the limited positions they had restricted themselves to through the choices, decisions, and agreements they had made. Consequently, they were now able to move with a greater liberation through more of their created selves, to become aware of more, that they can make better choices, identify the hidden parts of their creation, and unveil all those taplines they had been unconscious of up until now. To unveil, be aware and conscious of everything the created consciousness comprises of, means we now are no longer bound by subconscious taplines that resign us to cause and effect restricting creation. We see the full magnitude of our creation, the personal self, like an extensive library of books representing ideas. And now we can decide what books we will play with or not, what ones we will carry around and choose to be the effects of. Or indeed, we can leave the library alone and see it for what it is, as an overall reference, be aside from it, be in our real awareness therefore, and endeavour to recognise the is from this position, unburdened by creational-based ideas. Also on that occasion, as we pulled down the barriers of self-limitation, we encountered various dark force individuals representing authority that, if agreed with, would of course represent then another barrier we had decided for ourselves. But absent of agreement, these dark force characters, despite how big and mean they appeared, had no power to restrict us, except for that which we surrendered through agreement, and we just marched past them consequently. As I said, this parking lot features on occasion on the real side, as do many other different places that over time we can build up a catalogue of sights and features of our real side and learn to recognise their symbology. There are certain general themes and ideas on the real side that will have a standard representation for everyone, but also, as the unique beings we are, we will have plenty of additional features that are as unique to us as the beings we each are, and we come to recognise what these mean also. The real guides will utilise that which makes the best possible sense to us after all, regardless of what it is, to get their messages and awareness bolstering representations across. It is, after all about recognising the is, and so this is a process to be achieved by all and any means necessary, whatever creational ideas, themes, or place in the simulator that fits the bill. A reminder then that regardless of what we experience, it is creationally based, no matter how amazing it may be. For the true reality is invisible, and we ought endeavour to not get caught up in the experiences, as the idea is to recognise that which the experiences, and indeed any experience, is a comparison for, the isness, and standing real with that true reality. This real side parking lot is also made out of concrete, as most would be on the physical level. What better representation for creation can there be, with all the life levels and all the ideas of the created collective consciousness that comprises them? all encapsulated and contained in a concrete layer of restricting rigidity, except for the top level that is open to the sky, the ethereal level, the final aspect of the personal self, that is aside from the denser created consciousness mind and emotional parts, the best creational place to be positioned. For it is here that through the intuition we can receive best the impressions from the real awareness, then make the connection to and recognize the real awareness, and potentially the sky above representing the is quite literally the limit, or perhaps better to say the limitless. Anyway, so I was back in this parking lot again, and seemed I had a function here in this creational representing a place, that being as a kind of janitor to keep things in order. I had the impression that I had been doing this job for a very long time, I would suggest, since I first entered the simulator. For how is it that we can remain in a restricted simulator if we don't maintain the agreements and attachments that bind us to it through all the aspects of our personal created selves, all the layers of this parking lot, in other words? This very much presented as my being a janitor and keeping all these idea restrictions in order, almost like being the jailer of yourself, in a way. As the personal self holds on to its routines, agreements, and comfort zone ideas, and emotional attachments, this ensures it is resigned to the cause and effect of them until it decides differently. And what else would a parking lot contain? Cars, naturally. And as cars can represent attitudes of the personal self, well, what better representation of the convoluted and lifetime after lifetime compaction of ideas of the ever denser created consciousness could there be than a place full of cars? All these lifetimes of collective attitudes making up the overall created consciousness, parked forever in the simulator, until addressed and let go of, and until then effecting the gradual demise of a simulator that we need as our training school. And naturally, the attitudes of others will impact us also, if we operate strictly from the personal self-awareness only, as we emulate and take on similar attitudes that the personal self considers a benefit, generally to improve its social status in society, etc., and the attitudes of others will certainly have the personal reactive self engage emotionally, so one overall gigantic ball of attitudes. The created attitude ideas and the emotional mental reaction to them, ideas about ideas, that all get bundled into the overall consciousness of restriction, control, and authority. At this moment, however, as my process of awareness continues, and my real intent to recognize the is maintained, so would I perhaps recognize better the maintenance of my own creational restriction, exhibited in my role as the janitor / jailer of my own limited position in life. Naturally, over time, I would surmise that as my process continues, I would be maintaining less and less of the ideas that restrict me to creation, as I identify and release them one by one. And indeed, my impression was that the duration of my janitor shift here had lessened over recent times. It would have been a full-time job, of course, for as we sit in the personal self, with no interest to move beyond it, the maintenance of that limited position is absolute and constant. But as we decide to see and be more, to become more aware, to do that we would let go, little by little, of the ideas that maintain the absolute bubble prison we had placed ourselves in, removing the bars a little at a time, and so the maintenance of that which retains us in our personal self-limitation becomes less. And now, at this moment in the experience, my janitor duties were reduced to a couple of hours every morning, evidently still clinging on to and maintaining certain personal self-attachments, agreements and such. But also on this occasion, it seems I had no intention to even put in my 2 hours shift. I took a wander around the parking lot and seemed to pass into another area that my impression was not part of the simulator parking lot. For creation is its own reality, and the real awareness, and the real awareness real side is a reality aside from creation and the personal self real side. Were I to have remained in my personal awareness on the real side, I would have remained in the parking lot as a representation, but with the connection to my real awareness, we are afforded the opportunity to see beyond the bubble containment realities of the personal self that extends onto the real side, a containment that is so, unless we make the connection to the real awareness, that is the isness that is aside from the personal self. We rather allow the isness in, and as we decide to stand more and more in the true reality, the real side will consistently open up in accordance, everything equaling itself, in that we have experiences beyond our personal self-containments of however we have constructed the consciousness. And so I would enter the real awareness side of the real side, and here I would find a kind of military training area. Large numbers of individuals were going through their drills, with the various uniformed officers overseeing the progress of the soldiers. This I have seen on many occasions also. As we go about the process of becoming more aware, of being willing to carry out assignments that benefit all of life on the physical and the real side, of sharing the ease throughout all the creational dimensions, of earning our way and awareness, taking the risk to jump into the unknown, all this is interspersed with a constant training, refining, and preparation to have us hardened and ready for what we must face, as we face all of creation and ourselves. Very much like soldiers going through a boot camp, to prepare them to be as capable as possible, to be self-sufficient ultimately, and able to handle and deal with anything. And naturally then, all these individuals were of the becoming more aware, risk-taker variety, going through their boot camp preparations for all they will be facing. The officers would of course then have been the real guides, always on hand to assist in accordance with the extent that the individual is willing, has the intent and drive to do so. It's all about choice, decision, and while we're in creation, personal self-free will to continue on after all. The guides can only assist, and much like the ears, only if we allow them in. Agreement and free will are ultimately the keys to everything, or the keys that can have us locked in a confined creational prison of our own choosing. Amusingly enough, even though I had vacated my maintenance of my creational personal self-containment, I was carrying around a suitcase with me. The suitcase was full of paraphernalia, documents, and identification papers, suggesting that I was willing to walk away from the overall personal self, but still wanting to cling on to ideas, represented here by my carrying them around with me in a suitcase. All that it contained, representing whatever ideas they were, and perhaps a clinging onto the personal identity, was represented here, what with the identification papers and such, in my case. I would speak with some of the officers, and at one point I was encouraged to relinquish my suitcase, to put it aside in a safe place, and go with a few of the officers, the real guides, into an office for further dialogue. In the office, another individual would burst in suddenly, aggressively berating me over my abandoning of my parking lot duties, even though they were but a few hours now in daily duration. The real guides, the officers, sat back and watched on, evidently wanting to see what I decided. For this individual was a representation of the dark forces I would suggest, an overall embodiment of authority and control. For, of course, The dark force's primary objective is to keep everyone in creation through agreements to their created ideas, systems, attention and focus seizing mechanisms. Quite clearly, this character represented the overall dark force opposition to my choosing to continue to walk beyond the restriction of creation, and he was attempting to intimidate, or by any means that was effective, to get me to return to the maintenance of the creational ideas that would have me retained in creation, even though perhaps the ideas were less, a few hours now instead of a full-time job, but even one idea is enough to keep you in creation if clung to. His threats were continuous. He ought be applauded for his inventiveness, as he produced endless reasons why I ought return to my work, trying to appeal and encourage my personal self, and induce fear also, with repercussions for not doing so, etc. But again, we are always the deciders, and regardless of what we are confronted with, how convincing or intimidating situations and individuals may be to the personal self, we have to agree for the situations or the dark forces to have any bearing on our reality, and the guides could not realistically intercede or involve themselves. I had to make my decision, and therefore the officers would sit and wait to see what I would do. But my decision was made. I didn't want to go back to my janitor maintenance duties, and the dark force representation stormed off in outrage, but ultimately, defeat in the face of agreement he was unable to claim. I moved from the office with the real guide officers, and discovered that my suitcase of ideas I wanted to carry with me was missing. I asked the officer guides as to its whereabouts, and they rather shrugged non-committally. I asked some of the other soldiers. They had no knowledge of the suitcase's whereabouts either. But then an officer guide would tap me on the shoulder and gesture. I looked to where he indicated, and there was my suitcase in the middle of the training area, opened and with all of its contents absent. My personal self was somewhat alarmed, as of course these particular ideas were what it still held dear and was clinging to, and now they were gone. I noticed that a short in stature female was nearby, and handing out the last of the contents of my suitcase to some individuals. I stormed up to her, and was most upset at this situation, for it seems she had actually been selling the contents of my suitcase to whoever wished to purchase them, and then pocketing the monies. Although, as this woman bore my outrage patiently, I began to realize that, in fact, I wasn't actually that concerned as to the loss of these documents these ideas, that my outrage was more an automatic reaction from the personal self, for the detachment of ideas that evidently incorporated its comfort zone, but ideas nevertheless that represented restriction in creation. For many times the personal self is so routined with lifetimes of similar idea attachment that even if it realizes that the ideas are self-limiting, it will still seek to cling on to them through the emotional comfort zone familiarity that they provide, and react emotionally at being deprived of them. The personal self tends to operate on automatic unconscious pilot, clinging onto its patterns of familiar attitudes and ideas, with an almost built-in security system if these ideas are compromised, like trying to take a toy from a child. And many times we identify limiting ideas, attachments and agreements, but unless we remain conscious and standing real with the real awareness, we can slip into the personal self and nestle in the comfort zone ideas it has held dear for lifetimes. It is rather easy to slip into and immerse ourselves in what we know, rather than continue into the unknown and uncertainty of the endless isness. Evidently here, I was ready to let these ideas go, the ideas in my suitcase, but perhaps a little personal self-trepidation remained. The woman I suggest was a real guide also, and again she would not have taken my idea taplines away unless I agreed. So overall I must have decided this to be so, even though I carried the suitcase of ideas with me into this training area, and even though I indulged the personal self a little, and it reacted to its idea deprivation, despite it knowing that it was time to relinquish them. For we do need have the personal self aligned with the real intent of the real awareness, that to recognize the ease, for the awareness that we are overall must decide completely to stand real with the ease. Any less than 100%, and we're not there yet. And as our awareness extends to the personal self, a necessity, as we need recognize the real awareness and the ease from the comparative perspective of a created self and creation, the personal self-awareness must also decide and align with this real intent, or we are rather divided in our focus and intent. We rather have to drag the personal self along, as it moans, complains, is agitated, outraged and upset, but gradually we begin to see the sense of doing so, even through the agitation of the personal self and all its ideas and routines. And so I suddenly realized that my reaction was to ideas I really wasn't that interested in keeping, and just an almost automatic defense system reaction built into the personal self. because as the deciders of our experience, we can just as readily take back the ideas we are liberated from, as foolish as this might be. The real guides won't take away our comfort blankets unless we free will decide to give them up. The guide here knew that this was just my personal self having its momentary teddy bear deprived tantrum, and she knew that despite that it had no substance, that overall I was agreeing to having my ideas removed. Why she was selling the ideas to individuals may be that all ideas, even though restricting in and of themselves if we cling to them, have emotional attachment to them, etc., do still represent references, and everything references the ears, if used comparatively, to recognize the ears by. Every idea can have its place and value if we see them for what they are, but realize that in and of themselves, as they are created things, they cannot be the true reality life is. As we earn our way, we become more aware. We are rather paying, in a sense, for our awareness, and perhaps here, in my suitcase, these ideas did have an intrinsic value to them, that for certain individuals perhaps these were the very idea references they needed at this moment now for their next steps. For who knows what idea reference may be the spark that ignites a greater awareness, as everyone is different after all, and sees things in their own unique perspective ways. So perhaps these individuals would benefit from these ideas, that they too were on their individual processes of awareness, and effectively, as they paid this guide their dues for their idea references, this was representing them earning their way, paying in a sense for their next stage of becoming more aware. But the result for me was the same. My briefcase of ideas was empty, and after my little personal self moment, ultimately I wasn't concerned to see these ideas now absent. For overall, I recognized that to stand real with the guides and all life, we must be prepared to let all personal self ideas and creations go, that we must endeavour to stand always in the nowness of our real awareness, the isness life is, aside from the thoughts, emotions, and ideas of the personal self. And yes, the personal self will always have reluctance and the fear of stepping into the unknown, of the endlessness of the ears, but slowly, as we drag it along, as we focus more and more on the ears, the personal self will start to fade into the background, and eventually we will need it no longer, and stand real as the beings of light we actually are.
Well, Kevin, another movie that's terrific, so that explains a lot, and you did good, didn't you? So, again, many job interviews on the real side, and you're having fun. and especially letting so many people know what's going on and giving them many, many views. So, yes, thank you so much. That's great. Kevin the Great Witness, thank you.